Hello students, the theme of our lecture is communication.
The plan of the lecture consists of the first one, which is who says what to whom in which channel with what effect. The second one, behaviors and messages. And the third one, the ingredients of communication. As a science, intercultural communication includes many various elements and fields to study. To understand how people interact, one would need to study this matter from the point of view of psychology, linguistics, philosophy, social studies, and other important science relating to this complicated process. In our course of lectures, we are not going to try and cover all of them, but it would be reasonable to start with a notion that seems to be the most outstanding in intercultural communication theory. How do you understand communication and how can you describe it? Try to give your own definition to this term. Understanding human communication means knowing something about what happens when people interact, what makes it possible and necessary, what the consequent results of this process are, and finally what we can do to influence and maximize the effects of a particular communication event. To arrive at a final definition of communication, let us carefully study a few notions that will help us further. Traditionally, communication is the exchange of meanings or information that takes place between individuals by means of a shared symbol system. This sphere of human knowledge has been a point of interest from the ancient times, and still there is as many definitions of this concept as there are researchers who studied it. An English literary critic, Richards, defined communication as follows. Communication takes place when one mind so acts upon its environment that another mind is influenced, and in that other mind an experience occurs, which is like the experience in the first mind, and is caused in part by the experience. Horace Loswell, a famous American researcher of politics and propaganda, has stated the main problem of communication in the following question. Who says what to whom in which channel with what effect? It has been recognized as almost classic formula of communication and will be further used by us as a formula for cultural events analysis. Here is a more detailed presentation of his idea as suggested by one of the American universities. Who, communicator, control research, says what, message, content research, in what channel, channel, medium research, to whom, receiver, audience research, with what effect, effect, and effects research. So actually this formula takes us further by bringing up such questions as what is the process of communication, what makes this process possible, and what it consists of. However, let us look a little closer to some other elements that help us make a clearer definition of communication. Behaviors and messages. Our behaviors become messages to which other people may respond. When we talk, we are obviously behaving, but when we wave, smile, frown, walk, shake our heads, or gesture, we also are behaving. These behaviors frequently become messages. They communicate something to someone else. Before behaviors can become messages, however, they must meet two requirements. First of all, they must be observed by someone, and second of all, they must elicit a response. In other words, any behavior that elicits a response is a message. If we examine this last statement, we can see several implications. First, the word any tells us that both verbal and nonverbal behaviors may function as messages. Verbal messages consist of spoken or written words. Speaking and written are word-producing behaviors, while nonverbal messages consist of the entire remaining behavior repertoire. Second of all, behavior may be either conscious or unconscious. We frequently do things without being aware of them. This is especially true when nonverbal behavior involves such habits as fingernail biting, toe tapping, leg juggling, head shaking, stirring, and smiling. Even such things as slouching on a chair, chewing gum, or adjusting glasses may be unconscious behaviors. Since the message consists of behaviors to which people may respond, we must thus acknowledge the possibility of producing messages unknowingly. Third of all, we frequently behave unintentionally, in some cases uncontrollably. For instance, if we are embarrassed, we may blush or speak with vocal dissonances. We do not intend to blush or stammer, but we do so anyway. Again, these unintentional behaviors can become messages if someone perceives them and responds to them. If we think about this for a moment, we must realize that this is impossible for us not to behave. Being necessity is behavior. If behavior has communication potential, then it is also impossible for us not to communicate. In other words, we cannot not communicate. This concept of conscious and unconscious, intentional and unintentional, behavioral relationships gives us a basis to formulate a clear definition of communication. Communication may be defined as that which happens whenever someone responds to the behavior of the residue of the behavior of another person. Our definition leads us to the necessity of understanding two more important notions related to communication. They are behavior residue and attribution. Behavior residue refers to those things that remain as a record of our actions. For instance, this is say that your rating as a behavior residue is resulted from certain behaviors. As the authors, we had to change in a number of behaviors. We had to research, think, and use our words processors. Another example of behavior residue might be the odor of cigarette smoke lingering in an elevator after the cigarette smoker has departed. Smoking the cigarette in the elevator was the behavior. The odor is the residue. The response you have to the odor is a reflection of your past experiences and attitude towards cigarettes, smoking in public places, and perhaps people who smoke cigarettes. When we observe someone's behavior, a very important thing happens before we respond to it. We would not be able to respond if we didn't have a certain experience telling us what this particular behavior may mean as we compare it with other similar situations. In other words, we attribute a certain meaning to the person's behavior. Here's how the attribution might happen. When someone comes up to you and asks, "I have a problem, could you please help me?" you subconsciously draw all the meanings of this behavior from the experience storage in your head. The meaning you give it is drawn from your experience with language and word meaning, and also from your experience with this person and the social context. Your response could vary significantly depending upon prior experiences and the circumstances, even whether the person who asks the question is familiar or unfamiliar to you may lead to a different reaction on your part. This is what we call the attribution of meaning. Now that we understand what communication is, we can go on to the next important thing, which are the ingredients of communication. What are your ideas about this? Think and try to identify what can be called the ingredients of communication. Then, you may read on and compare your ideas to the authors. Let us examine the ingredients of communication, the various components that fit together to form what we all call communication. Since our purpose in studying intercultural communication is to develop communication skills to apply with conscious and content, our working definition of communication will specify intentional communication. Here's how we will further define communication. Communication is a dynamic transactional behavior affecting process in which people behave intentionally to induce or elicit a particular response from another person. Communication is complete only when the intended behavior is perceived by the intended receiver and that person responds to and is affected by the behavior. These transactions must include all conscious or unconscious, intentional or unintentional, verbal, nonverbal, and contextual stimuli that act cues about the quality and credibility of the message. The cues must be clear to both the behavioral source of the transaction and the processor of that behavior. This definition allows us to identify 8 specific ingredients of communication within the framework of intentional communication. Behavioral source. This is a person with both a need and a desire to communicate. The need may be a social desire to be recognized as an individual, to share information with others, or to influence the attitudes and behaviors of one or more others. The source wish to communicate indicates a desire to share his or her internal state of being with another human being. Encoding. Internal states of being cannot be shared directly. We must rely on symbolic representations of our internal states. Encoding is an internal activity in which verbal and nonverbal behaviors are selected and arranged to create a message in accordance with the contextual rules that govern the interaction and the rules of grammar and syntax applicable to the language being used. Message. It is a result of encoding an expressive behavior that represents the internal state to be shared. It is a set of verbal and or nonverbal symbols that represent a person's particular state of being at a particular moment in time and space. Although encoding is an internal act that produces a message is external to the source. It is behavior or behavioral residue that must connect a source and a responder across time and space. Channel. Messages must have a means by which they move from source to responder, and it is a channel that provides a connection between the source and a responder. It is a physical means by which a message moves between people. Responder. Responders observe a source behavior on its residue and, as a consequence, become linked to the message source. Responders may be those intended by the source to receive the message, or they may be others who, by whatever circumstances, intercept and perceive the behavior once it has entered a channel. Responders have problems with messages, not unlike the problem source have with internal states of being. Messages usually impinge on people on a form of light or sound energy, although they may be in forms that simulate any of the senses. Whatever the form of sensory stimulation, people must convert these energies into meaningful experiences. Decoding, that is what we call the process of converting external energies into a meaningful experience, is called. Decoding is akin to a source act of encoding because it also is an internal activity. Through this internal processing of a message, meaning is attributed to those behaviors that represent a source's internal state of being. Response. In other words, it is what a person decides to do about a message. Responses may vary from an unconscious decision to do nothing to a conscious, immediate, overt physical act of violence. If communication has been somewhat successful, response of the message recipient will resemble to some degree that desired by the source who created the response eliciting behavior. Feedback. This ingredient represents information available to a source that permits her or him to make qualitative judgments about communication effectiveness. Through the interpretation of feedback, one may adjust and adapt behavior to an ongoing situation. Although feedback and response are not the same thing, they are clearly related. Response is what a person decides to do about a message, and feedback is information about the effectiveness of communication. They are related because the message recipient's behavior is the normal source of feedback. These 8 ingredients of communication make up only a partial list of factors that function during a communication event. In addition to these elements, when we conceive of communication as a process, several characteristics help us understand how communication actually works. First, communication is dynamic. It is an ongoing, ever-changing activity. As participants in communication, we constantly are affected by each other's messages, and as a consequence, we undergo continual change. Each of us in our daily lives meets and interacts with people who exert some influence over us. Each time we are influenced, we are changed in some way, which means that as we go through life, we do so as continually changing or dynamic individuals. The second characteristic of communication is that it is interactive. Communication must take place between people. This implies 2 or more people who bring to a communication even their own unique backgrounds and experiences that serve as a backdrop for communicative interaction. Interaction also implies a reciprocal situation in which each party attempts to influence the other. That is, each party simultaneously creates message designed to elicit specific responses from the other. Third, communication is irreversible. Once we have said something and someone has received and decoded the message, we cannot retrieve it. This circumstance sometimes results in what is called putting your foot in our mouth. The source may send other messages in attempts to modify the effect, but it cannot be eliminated. This is frequently a problem when we unconsciously or unintentionally send a message to someone. We may affect them adversely and not even know it. Then, during future interactions, we may wonder why the person is reacting to us in what we perceive to be an unusual manner. Fourth, communication takes place in a physical and social context. Both establish the rules that govern the interaction. When we interact with someone, it is not in isolation but within specific physical surroundings and under a set of specific social dynamics. Physical surroundings include specific physical objects such as furniture, window coverings, lighting, vegetation, or the presence or absence of physical clutter, noise levels, and acoustics, as well as competing messages. Many aspects of physical environment can and do affect communication. The comfort or discomfort of a chair, the color of the walls, or the total atmosphere of a room are a bad few. The symbolic meaning behind physical surroundings, a kind of nonverbal communication, also governs communication. These symbols, modes, or additional indicators for intentions are often called paramessages. Para means near, going alongside from Greek. Social context defines the social relationships that exist between people as well as the rules that govern the interaction. Nevertheless, relationships such as teacher-student, employer-employee, parent-child, admiral, seaman, senator, citizen, physician, patient, and judge, attorney establish rules that specify expected behavior and thus affect the communication process. Quite frequently, physical surroundings actually define the social context. An employer may sit behind a desk while an employee stands before the desk to receive an admonition. In a courtroom, the judge sits elevated facing the courtroom, jurors and attorneys indicating the social superiority of the judge to the other officers of the court. Attorneys sit side by side, indicating a social equality between accuser and accused until such as the jury of peers renders the verdict. No matter what the social context, it will have some effect on communication. The form of language used, the respect or lack of respect shown one another, the time of day, personal moods, who speaks to whom, in what order, and the degree of nervousness or confidence people express are but a few of the ways in which the social context can affect communication. There are several factors involved in a process of communication that do not simply influence it, but influence it negatively. They are called noises and represent so-called hindrances that may decrease the effectiveness of communication. Just as the usual physical noise can make it difficult for us to hear things said, there are things that make it difficult for us to hear the message sent to us. It may involve our preconceived ideas, stereotypes, prejudices, limitations, editor focus, or descriptive thoughts that may be going through our mind during communication and such like. Figure 1 illustrates the main ingredients of communication process and their interrelation. Characteristics of communication are dynamic, interactive, and irreversible. Of course, talking about such a complex thing as communication, we cannot overlook the different forms that it takes and the different ways and channels through which the messages get to us.
Thank you for your attention.